Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us at the second of our Facebook Live question and answer sessions. I'll just explain a little bit about how this works. I'm here with my P&R colleagues, Deputy Steve Fowler.
Good evening.
And Deputy Charles Parkinson.
Good evening.
And what we're going to do is answer as many of the questions that have been submitted or are submitted live over the course of the next hour and a half or so. So if you see us looking off in that direction, that's because there's a big screen just to that side of the camera where the questions will flash up. And so we can't see the Facebook page itself, but there's someone in a room next door who is putting the questions through to us. So we've seen a few of the first questions, but after that we'll be flying completely blind. And actually, if you've got questions that relate to anything that we've already talked about, or further clarification, then please do send them in. So thanks very much for joining us on another lovely, warm, balmy evening. The other thing is that sometimes the automatic lights go off. So if you see us waving our arms, it's really just an attempt to get those back on again. But anyway, we may as well get started because I think we do have a few questions to get stuck into. The first question was submitted, and it was a very, very long question. And because of the format we're working to, the question has been shortened, not by us, by the people in the room next door. The question is essentially, I'm struggling to understand. Oh, sorry, this is from Horace as well. So we see first names, but we don't know second names. So I think I can guess which Horace this is. So I'm struggling to understand why we need GST at all. The real heavy lifting is not being done by GST. So why introduce it in the first place? Why not just keep the other revenue-raising measures? So I'll give this one a stab. And really, it's about the fact that this is a package, and it's designed as a package to work with the different elements supporting each other. So GST actually does do an awful lot of the heavy lifting. It does a lot of the revenue raising, which can then fund the significant tax breaks that will then be felt by people on average or lower incomes. So there are lots of different elements to that, but it's a point that Deputy Charles Parkinson has often made, which is actually when we look at where this revenue is coming from overall, it is a bit of a rebalancing of the tax burden. So one of the factors of moving to 0-10 all those years ago was the tax burden did fall more on individual shoulders. And actually what this package does in its totality is rebalance that a little bit, and it takes some of the pressure off individuals. And much of the revenue raised actually comes from corporates, businesses, visitors and wealthier residents in the island. But GST itself is a really important component of that. It means that we can capture a very significant chunk, around £11 million from the finance sector through the International Service Entities Scheme. And that's a scheme that is operational in Jersey as well. And that doesn't work without the GST element. You can't just make that into a standalone corporate levy because it wouldn't capture the same entities, and I don't think it would, the fees could be justifiable to the same extent. So that really only works in conjunction with GST because it's all about the exemption from GST. So obviously, a really big part of our proposals is to be able to reduce people's income tax and social security contributions, and that's why the different elements work as they do. We've actually got some wealthier people in the island who have arranged their tax affairs so that they pay little or possibly no income tax at the moment. But actually, if they're spending in the island, this package will mean that we are getting a contribution. And the more they're spending, the more comes into the public purse. So that really benefits us. So really, the overall message, and I will post a much more detailed answer to the more detailed version of this question, the overall message is that it is very much designed as a package with lots of different measures balancing each other off. And if you've seen a slight change, that's one of the lights going off. I hope it's not too distracting. But anyway, we'll move on to the next question, I think, if we've got something coming through. So this question is from Carl, and it is, under the proposals, single earner couples on £50,000 will be worse off than couples who are each earning £25,000. The single earner won't benefit from the proposed 15% tax rate as they already have their partner's unused tax allowance. Is this not unfair and discriminatory? Charles, do you want to answer this?
Yeah, certainly the single earner who's has an income of 50,000 will be worse off than couples that two partners that each earn 25k, but they'll still be better off than they were under the pre-existing situation. The reality is that we already have this quite generous ability to transfer a partner's unused tax allowance to the other spouse, and you know, they simply will that to some extent takes away the advantage of the two personal allowances, but they will still be better off. They both get the allowance for against the social security charges, and yeah, it's there's not much we can do to even that out.
So basically, to summarise, there'll be an increase in the personal tax allowance, which will be doubled in this scenario. So they'll benefit from that, and they'll also be better off than they are now, both because they'll be paying less income tax, but also because they'll benefit from the social security allowance, which doesn't exist in that form at the moment. So actually, they will still be significantly better off than now, even though Charles is right. They won't benefit as much as a couple who's earning £25,000 each. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that question. We'll see if there's another one coming through. So this one is from Chris, and the question is that statistics and data are 2 and 3 years out of date in some cases. How can you propose such radical changes using out-of-date information and know that it's correct and accurate? Now, I actually had a really interesting conversation with some actuaries, among others, and actuaries get very interested in all the technical details. So this is one that actually I would quite like to answer. So first of all, I know there's a bit of a misconception doing the rounds at the moment that some of our data, you know, the data being used is 10 years out of date. That's just not correct. The data that we are drawing on is absolutely in line with the data that would be used in other jurisdictions, and in some cases quite a lot more up to date. So for example, we've got the rolling electronic census, which gives us really granular information, and we've got things like the household expenditure study, which is from 2022, and all of the data sets. So there are a whole range of different data sets, and the important thing is that they've all been updated to 2026 values, and the even more important thing is that they have all been tested and the model has been validated. So there's a huge amount of data, absolutely vast amount of data that goes in, and a huge amount of testing that goes on around that. And we know that it's quite robust because when we ask the model to work out what a household, what the impact on a household might be, when we already know the answer because we've got real life data, or when we ask what the income, the revenue was, the income tax and social security revenue was in a particular year, when we already know the answer, but we haven't told the model the answer, we just ask it to use those assumptions, it comes back with essentially a really accurate answer, so within about 1% of accuracy, which is really robust. So I know that there is concern that our data isn't as up to date as it can be. The main message is we are using really good quality data. Everything has been adjusted so that it is relevant for today. And we know that it's good because we've tested it a lot and it comes up with really strong results which correlate very closely to real life results that we can validate. Yep. Okay, so we can't actually see the next question because there is a box on the screen, and I'm wondering if one of the tech people might be able to just sneak around and sort that out for us. I think it's a question from Daphne. There we go. So there's a tech pixie who has come to the rescue there. This is a question from Daphne, who says, you've put aside £1.1 million to help businesses adapt. How have you calculated this amount? How could you come up with a figure when you didn't know what it would be used for, please? So, Steve, do you want to take this?
Yeah, hello, Daphne, and thank you for your engagement over the times that we've discussed GST in the last year or so. The provision in the package, as we're presenting now, has been carried forward from the November 2024 resolution. So we've not changed it, and we recognise that resources will be needed by businesses to help them to make adaptations. And we've already consulted quite extensively with business groups and in some cases with individual business owners who have contacted us. And what we'll be doing is we will be co-designing solutions to the challenges that businesses identify using that budget. So the important thing is that we'll be working in partnership with businesses to provide bespoke solutions to the problems that they perceive will be occurring.
Okay. So if we can move on to another question. I think it's worth just expanding on Steve's point that actually the feedback that we've had from that industry engagement has been really helpful in shaping our proposals. We have made quite a lot of changes as a direct result of that feedback. So thank you very much, everyone who has engaged. It's really helpful. So the next question we've got is from Bruce, which is, won't the £300,000 threshold discourage businesses from expanding because crossing it creates significant compliance costs? Steve,
I'll take that.
That's probably for you. Yeah.
So that is not the experience in Jersey, who have an equivalent threshold. We've talked to them about this. And one of the reasons is because the way in which they structured their returns is very simple. It's around 7 fields on one side of an A4 sheet of paper. And we feel that actually keeping it simple, as Jersey do, is the best way forward. And in fact, it's almost contrary to your question, because some businesses will find it beneficial as they near the threshold and then pass it on the basis that they can reclaim their input GST at that point. And so, in fact, it's not a case of avoiding the threshold, but some businesses will choose to register as they're approaching the threshold in order that they can then benefit in the way I just described.
Yeah. The other thing that I probably should have warned viewers about is we do actually have some slides that, where relevant, we can ask to be put up on the screen. We can't see them, so we just have to trust that someone is showing hopefully the right slide. But if there are any questions where one of the slides that we have in our deck might be useful, then we will ask for that to be put up as well. Right, okay, so I'll see if we've got another question coming through. I think we are now in territory where we've never seen these questions before, so we've got no idea what's coming. This one is from Charles. Is that this one you sent in earlier, Charles? It is understood that people do not want GST, but do they not want GST plus? Do you think people understand the plus elements? Well, it might be one for you to answer, actually, Charles.
Yeah, the answer, I think, is no. I'm constantly being surprised that people haven't understood that there are cuts to income tax in the form of enhanced personal allowance, in the form of the 15% tax rate. I think a lot of people don't understand that they're going to get a personal allowance for social security contributions for the first time, and all they see is the GST, and they think that's what it's all about.
Can I just actually, I think this is an example where actually a slide would be quite helpful if we put one up. Can we have slide 9, please? Thank you. Sorry, do carry on.
Yeah, it's very important to understand that this is a package, and in fact it represents quite a lot of redistribution, both from the corporate sector to the personal sector, and also within the personal sector from people who have higher incomes to people with lower incomes. So the package is a very important element of what we're doing. Yeah,
so hopefully you can see a slide up on the screen at the moment which actually shows you who will benefit in what way. So the chart on the left-hand side of the slide that I hope is showing, the numbers across the bottom are 5% increments of household income. It's equivalised income. But anyway, anything above the line is households that will benefit under this package, and that is all the different measures combined. So here we're talking about income tax, social security, GST, and transport taxes, for example. And so the sum total of benefit is calculated. So you can see that actually a really good proportion of households are going to be better off under these proposals than worse off. And one of the questions that has come up in the last few days in particular is, well, how can that add up then? And I think the answer is about proportionality, isn't it, really? Because
yeah, but another answer is the chart on the right on the screen, because that shows that actually a relatively small part of the total burden is borne by households at all, and a very large part of the burden, 80% of it, is borne by businesses, employers, and tourists. So that's what makes the sums add up.
yeah. And when we're talking about households as well, it's important to remember, because we've got protections for income built into the package in the form of reductions for income tax and social security contributions, for example, and increases in things like pensions and income support, that actually when we're talking about the household consumption, that 20% that you might be able to see if the slide's still up on the screen, actually in terms of the net impact, that is coming from the higher income households. Yeah. And as we mentioned earlier, I think in relation to Horace's question, that includes people who are currently wealthy but not contributing much through income tax, and also that visitor consumption that you mentioned. Again, that's not something we can easily replicate, and I know, Steve, as a former member of economic development, you've looked into that visitor levy. Do you want to maybe touch on why the GST is a more effective form of getting a contribution from visitors?
Well, yes. I mean, the visitor spend is spread across a range of different holiday spending items that people will going out to restaurants, buying products from shops, etc. And I think the previous visitor levy, which was considered, would not have done as much heavy lifting as this will. And it just does really spread the load across a wider number of stakeholders. So the visitors are an important stakeholder in this. I'd also say, actually, in answer to this question, which is a really good one, none of us wanted GST. Yeah. None of us have voted for it in the past. And the reason that we can put our weight behind this now is because it is an effective way of moving away from an over-reliance on income-based taxation. And so we would not support this if we hadn't been able to bring in these mitigations. Mitigations aren't very sexy, and they're not being shouted about on social media. If those that have a natural aversion to GST, and I kind of get that, they are campaigning and shouting loudly, but we're not managing to get through that. There are lots of mitigations here, and lower income and middle income households will actually be better off under the package that we are presenting.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, I think actually, with the benefit of hindsight, I think we should have called them something other than mitigations, because mitigations just sounds like you're neutralising or something close to, whereas actually what we're doing is we're overcompensating, aren't we? So we appreciate that there will be some goods and services that will go up in price if we add a 3% GST. And with that, it's important to remember that that would not apply to some really big ticket items like your rent, mortgage repayments, healthcare, childcare, for example. So GST wouldn't apply to those things. But we do appreciate that goods and services are likely to go up a little. We felt that 5% was too much, and that's why we have brought that down to 3%, because we think that that will soften the impact of this and help to reduce or really contain any inflationary spike. In other words, a spike in the cost of living. So we think that's really important. But actually, because we're also increasing things like pensions and income support and other benefits that people or entitlements that people rely on for the cost of living, Actually, the overall impact of this package is an overcompensation. So even though people will be paying a bit more for those goods and services, it's really important to explain the proportionality of that, and that actually the benefit that they're likely to receive is way more than any additional costs that they might have to pay because of that 3% GST. So actually, I think we could have done better in calling them mitigations. I think that was some terminology that we inherited from the previous proposal. Actually, it's about income protection and additional benefit for, as you can see, if there's still a chart on the screen, I don't know if there still is, but if there is, you can see that actually the significant majority of households are going to be better off than they are right now as a result of these measures, even once we take increased prices because of GST into account.
So visitor consumption will account for 12% of the 39 million. When I go on holiday, I pay a consumption tax on things that I consume, and I can't say that that's put me off going on holiday. Now, I'm not saying that to brag, but I think it will be something that will be less noticeable to that particular stakeholder group.
And actually, I think in terms of how a visitor levy might work, I think that really you're talking about applying that to accommodation and stuff, which again doesn't capture things like your cruise ship visitors, popping into shops or grabbing some lunch somewhere. So actually, it's a more limited form of raising revenue from the visitor economy. Yeah. Okay, we've got another question here. It's from Victoria, who asks, is GST being applied to childcare fees? And if so, has any consideration been put in place to protect fee rises as a result of GST? I think actually we've done a spoiler for this, Victoria, and as the mum of 4 school-aged children and someone who has grappled with childcare costs in Guernsey for quite some time, I'm relieved to be able to confirm that no, GST would not apply to childcare. That's a really important point, and same goes with health and care services as well. Yeah, yep. I think that's a fairly straightforward answer to that question. Okay, so the next one is island-wide strike. Will the members of P&R be joining us on Sunday the 12th at Market Square? I literally, my feet haven't touched the ground. I haven't even looked beyond the end of today, and I don't know is the answer. I'm not sure we've had a chance to discuss it, but
I'm afraid I won't. I've got not only members of my own family, but also future in-laws coming to visit Guernsey from the Netherlands, and I will be spending the day with them.
Yeah.
Well, I can say that we're certainly, as Lindsay has said, we've got things now happening every day. Tomorrow evening we're at St Martin's Parish, for example, and I will be attending on Sunday, so I'll be happy to talk to anybody who'd like to ask me anything.
Yeah, I mean, I've got some pretty tricky family circumstances at the moment, so I will get there if I can, but I don't think I can make any guarantees at this point. But actually, speaking of that protest, it's really interesting because I've been trying to understand a little bit more about what is being protested. I mean, that sounds like it's an odd question, but actually, anyone that has contacted me directly about it, I've got the very strong impression, I don't know about my colleagues here, but I've got the very strong impression that actually the bit that people don't want is GST. When I've asked, well, actually, are you also protesting against a significant tax cut if you are an average earner? I've never yet had confirmation that this is about the package as a whole. Now, our package is not, we would not, I can guarantee, like Steve said earlier, we are a group of people, and actually as a committee, the members of us that were here in the previous term have never supported, GST, precisely because we've been concerned about the impacts of just GST. So we would never have put that kind of proposal forward. I think there might be an amendment that does. I think there's an amendment that says we just want the GST element, but that's not what we're proposing. And I'm actually quite interested to know from people who are attending the protest whether it's about the package as a whole or whether it's really only about GST. Because if it's only about GST, then I'd be interested to know their views on all of the other measures. But as I mentioned earlier, the other measures only really work in combination, in the combination that we've got now. So I think it is quite an interesting question, and happy to engage with people on that one. Yeah. Okay, so we've got just to let you know what really goes on here. So we can get little messages from the people in the room next door, which aren't for reading out, but we get the impression given by one of the notes that's been added that Horace wasn't very happy with his question being shortened. So the shortened version of the question is, why so much focus on being better off with millions of mitigations when the mitigations are only if we have GST? Well, that's so. Okay, let me have another go at this. We have to put our public finances on a stronger and more sustainable footing. Now, Steve just mentioned, annoyingly, I don't think we do have a slide to show for this, but Steve mentioned a really important point. We'll get one of the slides up. Can we please have slide 7? So the first point is that for a good while now, we have been bridging the gap between income and what we need to spend on infrastructure and public services from our savings. Now, on this chart, you can see the green bars, which are our savings effectively. And you can see that those are depleting, those are running out. And you can see that actually by 2031, they've been completely exhausted, and we start getting into sort of ghost bar territory. So that's the shortfall in our reserves. Now, really, no jurisdiction wants to be in a position where we're completely out of reserves. I mean, that's like having no savings at all, which isn't a responsible place to be as a jurisdiction. So this is one of the primary problems that we need to tackle. And this is one of the fundamental issues underpinning the need for tax reform in the first place, is the fact that you can see from this chart that we are on a fundamentally unsustainable trajectory here. And if we don't act now, then we really, really will be in a pickle. And that will affect people's quality of life in quite a major way. It will really constrain our ability to invest in infrastructure, which we know is a really important economic enabler, things like housing, for example, things like coastal defences, and all of the sort of infrastructure and public services that we rely on. So this is one of the most pressing reasons why we need to reform our tax base and make it more sustainable, because we cannot keep relying on our reserves because they are finite and they are going to run out. So that's the main thing. However, because we are the committee that we are, one of the things that particularly concerned us was the fact that actually we've heard from so many people in the community that they are struggling with the cost of living. So one of the objectives is to raise enough revenue in a sustainable way so that we can invest in our infrastructure and public services. But another thing that we thought was very important as a committee was to actually give people a bit of a break, because we know how much people are struggling. This is a wonderful place to live. We're very, very lucky in so many different ways. But my goodness me, it is an expensive place to live as well. And that's why we thought it was really important that actually we cut a bit of slack. And actually, Charles, you've been around for a very long time, and you can talk about that tax burden and how it's shifted maybe.
Yeah, well, we've seen already that a large part of the additional tax raised under this package comes from corporates, from employers and tourists, and a relatively small part comes from the resident local population. The other point I want to make is that we're very heavily dependent at the moment on taxes on income. I think 77% of our revenues come from income taxes or social security contributions, which are based on people's income. Now, the package basically brings in 55 million of GST and gives back substantial cuts in income tax and social security. And the effect of that is to rebalance our tax base, so that instead of deriving 77% of our income from income tax and social security, that will fall to 64%. And it therefore makes our revenue streams more resilient, diversifies them, and just basically makes the public finances more secure.
And
I was going to say, coming in at 3% as well enables us to have a really good stab at beginning to address the gap, the funding gap. And let's not forget that there are potential positive things down the road. And I like to think that this is buying us time. So we've given it a softer landing by putting in place the compensations. And also we're able to then have this sense check in 2030, where we can see if we've managed to grow the economy. And I genuinely believe and hope that we can. And I think, you know, the financial services industry, on which we all rely so much, and we all know people that work in it, they've come up with a strategy and they are determined to grow. And, you know, I really, really hope they can, and they will. We've got the wind farm, we've got the Pillar 2 receipts, which are still largely unknown. We can have a stab at guessing what they might be, but this buys us a little bit of time to redress the balance and to be able to still contemplate investing in our infrastructure, which is in places woefully underinvested, and you know, we're way behind.
Housing being a really good example of that.
That's true.
And actually, Charles made a really good point about our over-reliance on income-based taxation. I'd just like to return to that because it is a really important point. One of the problems that we have by being so over-reliant on income-based taxation as we are at the moment, so 77%, over 3/4 of our tax revenues coming from income-based taxation. This is a particular problem for a number of different reasons. The first is that the majority of that income is therefore coming from our working age population. And we've got an issue with our demographics at the moment, which means that we all know this, we're getting older like everywhere else, or everywhere else in the developed world. We're getting older. And this is worsening something called the dependency ratio, which is essentially the ratio of working age people to people in retirement. Now, we all know that people in retirement also contribute, but when you look at the share of what they contribute, the heavy lifting really is done by that working age population. So when that is shrinking and the number of people who have worked their entire lives and are now drawing pensions is growing relative to that number, we've got a sort of two-pronged problem, because actually demand for public services goes up. And that's just natural, because as we get older, we draw a pension, and we've contributed to that all our working lives, so that's great. But pensions go up above inflation year on year, so that you know, puts a lot of pressure. I think it's something like 20% of our public expenditure is on pensions. So the more people that are drawing pensions has an impact. And we also know that it's just incredibly natural. As we get older, we are going to need more in the way of healthcare and social care. So the demand for public services goes up as we all get older as a community, and as more people you know, move into their retirement years, and we're living for longer, which is lovely, but it does mean that we are going to see a growth in terms of that health demand. And just to put a number on that, it's around £6.5 million more each year to provide exactly the same level of service as we provided the year before above inflation. So that gives you an idea of just how you know, material the impact of that demographic change is. And the other thing that I think is important to mention is the potential impact of AI, for example. So it could have some real benefits in terms of productivity, but one of the things that people around the world are worried about is that it might impact our employment rate or earnings. And if that happens, and because we're so reliant on income-based taxation, if we were to experience a shock in terms of our employment rate or earnings, we'd again have a sort of double-pronged problem on our hands, because we would have less money coming into the public purse, but we would need to pay out more money in order to support the people who maybe have lost their jobs, or you know, can't find work, or are suddenly, you know, become reliant on income support or other benefits like that. So these are some of the issues why we need to reform our tax base. Essentially, the current system is unsustainable. Our reserves are running out. We're over-reliant on income-based taxation. We need to broaden our tax base to make ourselves more resilient and put ourselves in a less vulnerable position. And while we're doing that, we can also take away some of that pressure on the cost of living for households that are struggling. Okay, so Neil has sent in a question which says, I'm quite curious why Charles, who I voted for on a no GST stance, is now pro GST. Probably one for you, Charles.
Yeah. Obviously, my preference, as stated in my manifesto, was to reform our corporate tax system before any new taxes were introduced on the resident population. Now, I chaired a tax review subcommittee of P&R, which was advised by some very eminent experts, and they concluded that we could not go further on corporate tax reform without Jersey and the Isle of Man. They did recommend some changes to the corporate tax system, which would bring in about £6 million a year, and we've included those changes in our package. So essentially, what I wanted to do, I found was experts were saying we couldn't go there. Now, I didn't vote for the November 2024 package, and nor did my colleagues on P&R, because we thought that the package was unfair. And this package has been redesigned with a lower tax rate and with more compensations so that there is a better balance. And as we've said, and I think it bears repeating, most of the tax which would be raised under these proposals would come from companies, from employers and from tourists. The amount of tax that would be collected from individuals would be very much reduced, only 20% of the total. And within that package, within the proportion raised from individuals, that's very skewed. There's a lot of redistribution in there, and therefore the burden in that section falls heavily on those who are better paid. So that most people on low or average incomes would be better off. And that's why I can now support this package.
Thank you. Right, we'll see if we got another question coming through. The suspense is killing me. We've got no idea what's coming. It could be anything. There we go. We've got one from Luke. And Luke asks, what's going to be done about money being wasted with things like States Works and contaminated soil at the airport? Treat the cause, not just the symptoms. Those are both things that fall into the STSB mandate. Charles, are you happy to?
Yeah, I'll have a go at that. The contaminated soil at the airport has been there since the 2000s, early 2000s, when the airport runway rehabilitation scheme was undertaken. And these are everlasting pollutants, which are increasingly perceived as very dangerous. And we can't just simply leave the contaminated soil there. The only way to get rid of that contamination is to ship the soil off island, where it can either be washed or burned at very, very high temperatures for long periods. And nobody wants to have this problem. It's certainly not a problem we caused, but it's one we've inherited. And it would be irresponsible just to leave that contamination in our soil, because sadly it will start to creep into the water system, and we absolutely have to do something about it. And it's a serious problem, because it's going to cost us 16 million to ship the soil off the island and get it treated, but it simply cannot be left untreated. That's you call it money being wasted, but actually this is necessary expenditure to deal with a problem that we didn't create. It was created a long time ago, 20 years or so ago, and we're picking up the pieces. This is something we have to deal with. Now, States Works you mentioned, and I'm curious about that, because actually States Works is profitable in most years, and I don't quite know what you think is being wasted there. But you know, that is actually within the trading assets, that is one of the more successful branches of the operation.
I think it's worth, Luke hasn't asked directly about this, but I think it is worth touching on savings and efficiencies. And actually we do have a slide which will talk to this, and it's slide number 1, I think, if our tech people wouldn't mind putting that up. And essentially, we felt, although this doesn't add, this isn't included in our sort of overall numbers about how much net revenue is raised, but it is an aspect that we feel is really important. So we feel as though we can't go to the community talking about tax reform unless we're prepared to demonstrate that we're really serious about making the most efficient and effective use of taxpayers' pounds as we possibly can. So this slide here just touches on a couple of different things on that theme. And the first is something that the States has in fact already agreed to aim for, which is a 1% per year efficiency saving, if you like, in public sector expenditure for the next 3 years. So that accumulates over 2027, 2028 and 2029, meaning that by 2029 we will hopefully be saving £20 million a year compared with now. So we're hoping to bring that baseline expenditure down, and that we want to achieve through efficiencies, not through cutting public services. So that's something that P&R is working with committees on, but at the end of the day, this is a really important collective effort, and everyone really needs to look for those efficiencies. To give an example of the type of efficiencies that may well do some of this, certainly in P&R, we've been very, very careful about expenditure on consultants, external consultants, for example. So we are generating some efficiencies there, but also things like using technology to deliver that efficiency as well. So things like e-rostering in healthcare. You can imagine with a really large, complex workforce like we see in our healthcare sector, actually, if someone's having to manually organise all that rostering, then that's quite a labour-intensive piece of work. If we can give them the right tech to assist them, then there are genuine efficiencies to be had. And we're also rolling out something called priority-based budgeting. And that's really about giving committees again, because this is, it's under our committee system, this is where a lot of the expenditure happens, giving them a real opportunity to get under the bonnet and really challenge how that money is being spent in delivering, making sure that it is delivering what is intended to deliver, making sure that if there are opportunities to make efficiencies, that we're doing that, and also really to challenge whether we are providing the right services in the right ways and making some decisions around that if not. So I think it's important, even though the numbers aren't included in our overall revenue, net revenue raising, it is really important to stress that this is something that we take very, very seriously, and it's a priority not just for our committee, but indeed actually for the States as a whole, because they've supported this by a significant majority in the States already. So certainly that first 1% over 3 years accumulating is something that has strong support across the Assembly, and every committee is working towards that. So we've got another question here, which is from Sharon, who asks, can you remove the cap for high earners so they continue to pay tax on all their earnings? And
yeah, we're looking at the tax caps, both to see whether they're necessary, but also to see whether they're targeted at people we particularly want to attract to the island. And so the work on that's ongoing, and I can't really preempt the conclusions and tell you what we're going to decide to do. But it's an issue we're well aware of, and we are looking into it.
But we do understand there are various considerations around that as well.
It's not, these are complex issues. And of course, I was around when the tax caps were introduced, and they were introduced under competitive threat, effectively, from Jersey and the Isle of Man, who were trying to lure away our wealthier residents. And they were offering tax caps, and we felt obliged to do the same. But it's time to have another look at that, to see whether the caps are set at an appropriate level, and to see whether they're targeting the right people.
Okay, so we've got a question now from Louise, who asks, before raising GST, why aren't you looking more deeply at your own cost base? For example, your career average earnings pension provision. So Certainly, I don't think Louise is talking about our pension provision, because deputies don't have any such provision. I think that's probably more a question around state's employee pension provision. And certainly, there have been already a number of changes, haven't there? I mean, I'm not as well versed in the entire history, but I know that is something where changes have been made. But I think, you know, to the point about raising GST before looking at your own cost base, this is something that we've already touched on, in that it's not, we are doing both. It's not about one or the other. It's really important that we do both, but it's also really important that we do both at the same time, because we don't have the luxury of time. If we can just maybe pop up slide 7 again, please. This shows that actually our reserves are running out, and we really don't have the luxury of time to see what happens. And Steve mentioned a bit earlier the fact that there are potential future revenue streams, and I agree with him. I think, you know, personally, I'm quite optimistic, or at least hopeful, on Pillar 2 receipts coming in a bit higher than we're currently expecting, the potential for offshore wind, which is some work that I've been very involved in for a long time, and as Steve mentioned, the economic growth initiatives that we've got underway at the moment. But the point is, we can't bank those at the moment. It wouldn't be responsible to say, well, we're sure, you know, we're confident that these are going to come home for us and, you know, bridge this funding gap. So as Steve mentioned earlier, it's really about giving ourselves, broadening the tax base, as we've already talked about, why that's why that's so important. And it takes a little bit of time as well to change the tax system. So that's why we really do need to act now. But it is important that we're not just doing one thing or the other. We do need to act so that we don't hit that bottom line and start, you know, getting very much into the shortfall in reserves situation.
And not only that, we do have, we've been in P&R now for 1 year since the election, and we have a chief executive who is bold and is tackling issues where angels fear to tread, frankly. And I think that gives me also a great amount of hope that some of these thorny issues that do exist but can't be solved in 5 minutes will be addressed moving forward. And you know, it's only right that we do continue to look at every opportunity to save money, every opportunity to make sure that things are proportionate, and that we're not in any way overpaying for the services that the public service consumes, including employment.
Yeah. And efficiency generally, I think it's a really good point to raise. I mean, we were very transparent, and because we were absolutely horrified, weren't we, when we discovered about some of the historic projects which have, you know, not delivered what they needed to deliver. Yeah, exactly. And so that is something that we've been really focused on. When it's just not acceptable is the short answer. And so, as Steve describes, there is a lot of work going on to make sure that that situation just does not recur.
And you've spoken about the efforts we're making to drive down public expenditure through efficiencies and review of service levels and so on. But the fact is, we're running down the up escalator, aren't we? Because the costs are constant, especially in health, are constantly rising. And every time we make an efficiency saving, it just gets swallowed up, basically, in increases in health spending. So we have to do something about the tax system.
And also we have to, one of our super priorities that we've agreed as an assembly is to look at a more sustainable model of health and social care, including a more sustainable funding element of that. And that's really important, because we know that we don't have a static baseline. We can't compare like for like, year for year, because we know that the demand is going up for those reasons. Yeah. Okay. So we've got another question. And it's from Lars, who says, yesterday, Deputy Steve Fuller has mentioned that even after income tax cuts and other measures, it would still leave households collectively around £4 million worse off. How can you justify this?
Hello, Lars. Well, firstly, it wasn't me that said that. So perhaps I won't justify it. But
I may have said it.
well, you can take over from me in a moment. But what I would say is, what I would reiterate is, which is a point I've already made this evening, is that lower and middle income households will be better off. Okay. So I can't think why I would have said that, but perhaps Charles did say it, and perhaps he can explain what he meant.
Well, you've just captured it, Steve. Yes, collectively the resident population would be 4 million worse off, but there's a significant redistribution effect going on within the package. So the burden falls on the higher income earning households. And the point is that the corporate sector, companies, employers, and even tourists are going to be paying vastly more than the resident population. We're aiming to collect a net 39.5 million through this package, and you can see that most of that, the vast majority of that, doesn't come from households. It comes from companies, from employers and tourists. And that's why the package is able to leave so many people better off in terms of the resident population. Effectively, we're taking back some of the transfer of the tax burden that happened under 010, when a large proportion of the corporate tax burden was shifted onto the resident population. And this is transferring some of that burden back to the corporate population and off the shoulders of the resident population. So that's why I can support it.
And again, it comes down to distribution and proportionality, doesn't it? Yeah. So I don't know if we got slide 9 up on, but if we, yeah, I think we do. Again, so the chart on the left shows you that about 75% of households there, you know, in terms of the income centiles, as they're known, would be better off, and that the highest quartile, the sort of highest income households are the ones that would be worse off. But what this chart doesn't show you is the difference in the actual monetary amount. And the really key point here, alongside what Charles has said, is that actually wealthy people, some of whom might not even be captured in the top income brackets because they might have arranged their tax affairs despite being very wealthy to not have an awful lot of income and not pay very much income tax. But if they are spending a lot of money in the island, then actually the revenue that you can generate from those wealthy people who are spending an awful lot more can help to support or fund effectively the tax breaks for a much larger number of people who have got less income coming into their household. So it's all about proportionality. If you think about you know, a household that spends £100,000 a year, you know, if we assume that it wouldn't be 3%, but if we assume that there's a percentage of that expenditure is coming into the public purse, actually that really helps to support the tax cuts that we can then provide to people on average and lower incomes. And so that's how it works, that redistributive element. So yes, even though the overall headline figure might be £4 million, when you look at the net impact, it's really important to explain that actually the households that are being negatively affected, in other words, the households that would be worse off compared with now, are the higher income and the wealthier households, not the households who have got average or lower incomes, who will be better off in totality, even once you take into account any GST that they would pay on their expenditure.
But 35 million of the 39 million will come from companies, employers and tourists. That will not come from the resident population.
So that speaks to the point about really diversifying our tax base and making us less vulnerable to being so reliant on a single type of income. Okay, so we've now got a question from Simon, who asks, can you three not see this whole silly idea is on the ropes and you are damaging your political legacies persevering with it? Well, the first thing I would say, Simon, is I couldn't care less about a political legacy or any personal impacts. I would not be proposing this package if it wasn't something I believe that was going to benefit the most people in the island that it possibly could. That's what matters to me. I know that's what matters a lot to my colleagues. And this isn't about personal political careers. Doesn't even come into the equation, not relevant. We are here to do a job, and that is to make decisions that are in the best interest of the island. Now, we can't do nothing. There is a massive cost to doing nothing, and actually there's even a massive cost to delay. We know that we need to reform our tax base in order to avoid crashing into that zone where we've completely depleted our savings as an island, because we know that actually the people that will pay the price of that are the people that rely on infrastructure and public services. So, for example, we know we've got a housing crisis. How many times have you heard, Simon, because I know I've heard it a lot, people saying, come on, states, you know, you really need to increase the supply of house building. You've got some levers that you can pull here. You need to be investing more. And we are. We have heard that message. We are absolutely doing it. But you know what? It's not free. We need to be able to fund that kind of investment in our social infrastructure and the kind of infrastructure that our economy relies on as well. And so really, there is no do nothing option that doesn't have significant impacts. And that's why we're putting forward the package that we are. But I think my colleagues can really speak for themselves.
Yeah, I think I need to answer that one. I would like to think of myself as a conviction politician. And quite simply, I can't have it on my conscience that we can see the General Reserve peter out in the next 4 or 5 years, and then we'd be having to take much more drastic action than we're trying to do with this very balanced package that we've brought to you now.
Charles, anything to add?
I think we've covered it several times over. Honestly, I would not be supporting this if I did not think it was better for lower and middle income families in Guernsey, and if it wasn't necessary for the state of our public finances.
Yeah. So, Simon, I think 2 main themes to answer your question. First is we need to reform our tax base because our current system is absolutely unsustainable and we're going to hit the buffers unless we actually take action. And the second thing is we know that people right now are struggling with the cost of living, and this is an opportunity, and it's really a unique opportunity. It's a really exciting opportunity as politicians actually to be able to actually make the cost of living easier for people. That kind of opportunity does not come around very often, and I think in a high cost jurisdiction like ours, that's a really important consideration and a chance that we should be grabbing with both hands. Andy has asked a question, and it seems as though there are several questions along this particular line. Andy's asking, what is going to keep it at 3%, at the 3% that you're asking for, and not raising heavily, or I think rising heavily within weeks, in weeks of it coming in, like fuel duty did? Oh, we haven't touched on fuel duty. Maybe I'll come back on that. I mean, I'm happy to give this a shot, or does anyone else?
Yeah, you
okay.
Can talk about it.
Andy, really good question. And I have to say that actually one of the reasons I didn't support the previous package that was actually agreed by a majority of the Assembly in November 2024 was precisely because of this fear. Now, my fear was that if you introduce a tax like GST, for governments, there is going to be such a temptation just to turn that dial up, turn up that, get more coming out of that tap. And that was one of the things that really concerned me, because I didn't want it to be the thin end of the wedge. And before we know it, it's introduced at a low rate, and then before we know it, it's gone up a lot. And that was actually one of the reasons why I couldn't support the previous package. So one of the things that we have actually put in place, and I'm pleased to say that the States Assembly has already agreed with us on this, they've already agreed to this, is that actually we're going to put some protections around that. So first of all, we are going to put into our legislation around this, we've committed to putting into legislation the fact that if the rate, and I'll come back to this in a minute, if the rate were to go up in future, that all of those protections around income, all of the things that we've been talking about that actually help people cope better with the cost of living, would maintain their value. So in other words, they wouldn't get eroded over time. So that's one important point. But actually, to answer your question more specifically, we are also committing that there will be no change in the rate before 2030. And that's really important. Steve touched a bit earlier on some of the potential questions, some of the potential future sources of revenue that we could see coming down the line, but we don't have that clarity or certainty just yet. So things like our Pillar 2, which is a big international corporate tax, we could see more income from that than we're expecting. We could see some significant revenue coming in from offshore wind. We could see some of the effects of the finance sector growth strategy and a variety of other things. We could find more efficiencies than we're expecting, for example. But we need to have a little bit of time to see how these measures are working and to see what materialises with respect to those questions. So what we're proposing is that there's a review in 2030 which will allow the states at that time to make a much better informed decision using all the real world data about how the measures have actually worked in real life, what savings we've achieved, Pillar 2 revenue, offshore wind, AI impacts, etc., etc. And they can make a decision about whether the measures that we've got in place now are sufficient to keep that funding gap closed, or whether they need to make any kind of adjustments. But we have committed that it will not go up before 2030. It's a really important point for all of us. And we've also committed to make sure that if in future, beyond that review, if the rate does ever go up, then so will all the protections that mean that people are better off than they are at the moment. So I think those are the two main points to that. But yeah, certainly that was one of my core concerns.
And we're proposing to cut fuel duty, of course.
Yeah, that's true. We haven't.
Yeah, we haven't touched on motoring taxes,
Yeah.
but we're conscious of the fact that electric vehicles currently don't contribute, and petrol-driven cars do, because it's all of the motoring taxes are on fuel, petrol or diesel. So one of our proposals is that there's an annual charge, like we used to have motor tax in Guernsey, which would apply to all vehicles, including electric vehicles, and there would be a significant cut in fuel duty.
Yeah, and actually, the reason fuel duty has gone up over and above inflation year on year is exactly the problem that we're trying to address with that. So the decision was taken about 20 years ago, and it made perfect sense at the time to put all our eggs in one basket, because it felt a lot fairer, didn't it? It felt like it was user pays. Yeah. But no one really then had the crystal ball to know that 20 years on, that actually first of all, vehicles would become so much more fuel efficient. So in other words, people are buying less fuel to do the same number of miles. And that's a great thing for the environment, perhaps, but it's not a good thing from Treasury's perspective, because it means that we don't get that income coming into the public purse. And also, it didn't really anticipate the big rise of hybrid vehicles, which also use less fuel, and of course EVs, which are an increasingly significant portion of market share. And so what that's meant is that the fuel duty has had to go up year on year above inflation for quite a long time now, because to maintain a steady amount of income coming in from that, we've had to run to stand still. And that's been a core problem. And actually, when it comes to the proposals on transport taxes, it's essentially that problem that we need to address, because again, a bit like income-based taxation, it's unsustainable. We can't carry on like that. So we've got to broaden that tax base, and that's what we're doing. So there will be a significant cut in fuel duty. And if you have a light, so the annual charge that Charles referred to will be based on weight and emissions for private vehicles. And that means that if you've got a small car that doesn't emit very much, then you won't pay very much at all. If you've got a really heavy vehicle that has very high emissions, then you will pay a bit more in the year. But the most important thing is it becomes a much more sustainable source of revenue that isn't going to become increasingly unfair in the way that fuel duty did, because you're quite right, Andy, it did have to go up above inflation year on year. And the other thing to mention is that for really high value vehicles over £50,000, there will be an additional surcharge for private vehicles applied at first registration. So again, that's income from people that arguably can afford to contribute a bit more. It's a kind of contribution that a lot of other jurisdictions use, and that is also part of the proposals, but it would only apply to high value vehicles more than £50,000 at first registration. So that's just a touch on some of the transport changes. Okay, so apparently we've still got lots of questions, so maybe that's a hint from the people in the room next door that we might need to speed up a little bit. Nick is asking, I have spoken with others who have completed the living expenses review, and all of us stand to save between £600 and £900. I think it missed me per annum. Yeah. It says per calendar month, but I think it's probably more likely per annum. Can you explain in detail as to who the increased revenue will come from?
Yeah. Certainly, where most of it comes from is from companies, employers and tourists. Only 20% of the income raised will come from residents on the island. And as we said, there's a big redistributive effect within that. So in fact, the bottom 3/4 of the income spectrum will be benefiting, not paying more. So it's not surprising to us that you will find that you stand to gain a not insignificant amount of money from these proposals. That's the intention.
Yeah. And actually, we do have a slide which might help with this, one that we haven't shown so far, and that's slide 0. If we can ask our tech people to please dig that one out and pop it on the screen. And this shows the different strands, really, of the package. What you can see here is we put that savings in there. We haven't added that into the calculation, but as we talked about earlier, we do think that's really important for us to really reconfirm that we're very committed to that. We take that very seriously, and that is a priority. The reason the income tax changes is in red and it's got a minus ahead of it is because actually that's what we're giving back. So Nick, when you say that all of the people who've done the calculator, and thank you, by the way, for actually using that tool, I would encourage anyone who hasn't had a go with it to please do that. We'll try and put it out on maybe our social channels again. So the reason that people are better off is because a lot of the heavy lifting is coming from that really quite significant reduction in income tax and social security contributions. And the way that works is if you're a high earner, it balances out at some point. So you won't really feel any benefit from that beyond a particular income level. But actually, if you are average income or anything below that, you are going to see a net benefit. And that's really because we are able to fund those changes, that cut to income tax and social security contributions, because of the revenue that we're raising from those other elements. And you can see there that there are lots of different strands to this particular package. Okay, in the spirit of speeding up, we'll move on to Alistair's question. The overriding message online is a loss of trust in the civil service and politicians due to the IT and hospital failures. So how can P&R and the Assembly regain the trust of the electorate?
I agree, Alistair. It's a big challenge and it's one that we've been presented with. So I think we've already seen action taken to address some of that by the Chief Executive. I referred to that earlier. And there is a big, it's incumbent on P&R and other committees now to ensure that the way in which projects are managed has better governance, the way in which we spend our money is much more rigidly challenged, robustly challenged as we go into major projects. And we're starting to do that. We're seeing oversight groups formed on major projects, which are really holding feet to the fire, perhaps in a way that hasn't happened before. Now, I'm not one for knocking the past, but this P&R is the one that has inherited quite a lot of this bad news, and this P&R is doing its best to try and sort it out.
Yeah, that's right.
The only way we can regain the trust of the electorate is to be very competent for a long, long time. you know, it'll be many years before the public forget, if they ever forget, the disasters that we inherited. And our mission must be to ensure that we don't make any more mistakes, and that we put right what we've inherited.
We need to walk the walk, and you're right. Trust is very slow to be earned and very quickly lost, and so we're very aware of that, and we're doing our absolute best to demonstrate that the public can trust us again. Okay, so a question now from Aaron, who's asked, can someone please explain how the GST proposal will impact some of the older generation on minimum pensions, please? I mean, I think the first thing to explain, and it's something that actually we haven't been particularly explicit about in this Q&A certainly, is that pensions will go up. So as well as all the income tax and social security contribution changes, we are going to make sure that pensions will go up to compensate for any increase in cost that those pensioner households or individuals might experience. But also, there's an element which we are also introducing called the Essentials Cost Relief Payment Scheme. And that's for people who would typically be pensioners, I think it's fair to say, who aren't currently claiming income support but are still in that category where they're struggling with the cost of living. So as well as their pension going up in order to compensate for any inflationary spike, any increase in the cost of living, they will also be able to access some money to help them meet any costs that haven't been covered by other elements.
And just to add to that, the increase to pensions will be in advance of these new measures being brought in. So there won't be a case of having to catch up and go without while waiting for the states to sort it out. It's going to be before.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Yeah, thank you. Right, we'll see. We've got another question from Simon. I don't know if it's the same Simon or a different one, but he says, since we had island-wide voting to get you elected as politicians, can we have a referendum and an island-wide vote for GST?
Look, if we had an island-wide vote on any tax, the answer would be we don't want it. No taxation is ever going to be popular. We're trying to manage the public finances sensibly and responsibly, and we're trying to do some engineering, if you like, within this package to take some of the burden off the lower paid and move it on to corporates, employers and tourists. And that's what the package does. Now, we have been elected only a year ago, and you've very kindly placed your trust in us to manage the island's finances to the best of our ability and in your best interests. And that's what we're trying to do. And I just ask you to trust us.
Also, I think it's really interesting because certainly a lot of the discussion that I see online in particular is really only focused on the GST element, and I can well understand. I mean, we've already talked about earlier on in this session how none of us are naturally inclined towards GST because on its own it is what's called regressive. It is disproportionately, it disproportionately impacts in a negative way people who have less money compared with people who have more money. But we've been so careful and so determined to flip that on its head. So actually, because this is not a proposal just about bringing forward GST, because this is a proposal for a balanced package that does lots of different things in lots of different ways and really blends those different threads together, we are putting forward a package that has the opposite effect to what just a straightforward introduction of GST would do. So actually, people with less income are going to benefit much more than people with more income. So it flips the normal GST dynamic on its head. And that is so important. So actually, I mean, I agree with Charles. There are a number of reasons why I don't think a referendum would be a sort of workable or particularly good idea for this question. But if there were to be a referendum, the more pertinent question would be, would you like to have a significant reduction in your income tax and social security contribution that far outweighs any increase that you might pay through GST. And so it's really, I can understand why the GST element is the bit that people focus on, but really I think the important question is, do you want to be better off overall? And I appreciate that doesn't apply to the really high earners, the wealthier residents in the island, but it certainly does apply to the majority of households in Guernsey and Alderney. And so I think actually, if we were to put a question to the people, that would be the question that we should ask. So we've got another question here from Sam. He said that given the current tax department can't cope with a simple flat rate tax, how are they realistically going to cope with a vastly more complex step tax rate and GST? Well, actually, I think that's got a couple of assumptions that aren't quite correct, and my colleagues can probably jump in. But actually, our current income tax and social security in particular is actually much more complex than the introduction of a GST would be by comparison. However, it does raise another really important point, and again, this is one that we've been really upfront about, isn't it, in terms of there are problems with the backlog at the Revenue Service at the moment, and again, a bit like addressing the way that we manage projects to make sure that they're delivering value for public money, and a bit like finding efficiencies in the way that we deliver public services. This is another absolutely core priority for us. Steve touched on this area a little bit earlier. This is something that we're working with the Chief Executive and Head of Public Service on. We've got some a new team or a new leadership into the Revenue Service in order to really get to grips with the issue that has developed there. And so even though I have to be completely upfront, there isn't an overnight solution to that, there is a recovery plan in place, and we are seeing that backlog come down now. And so that is a situation that we are very much on track to resolving, but it will still take time.
Yeah, we're working to resolve the problems at the Revenue Service by the end of next year, and GST would not come in until 2028. So hopefully by the time we bring GST in, if we bring it in, the problems at the Revenue Service will be behind us.
But they'll be improving all the time as well through that, so it's a reducing scale of problem. Emma,
I'll take this.
Yep, okay.
So Emma's asking, if families and businesses are expected to balance their budgets, should the states be held to the same standard? If so, what evidence can you show that you've reduced unnecessary spending first? I think that's a really good question. I mean, the first answer I would give is that a government is quite different to a family or a business. We have essential services that we have to provide, and some of those, for example, health and education, are becoming increasingly expensive. We haven't got the option that perhaps a business would have to say, well, this isn't working for us anymore, so we'll stop doing that. We have to do it. And that is one of the problems facing all governments, but certainly ours. So what I would say is that we are beginning to look at new areas, and the one that we talk about at the moment is our use of consultants. In the past, it's been common to outsource certain projects and advice to outside external consultants. And that's something that's now being challenged every single time it's raised, and it's already been reduced. So we haven't got the proof of that yet because it's still just emerging into our thought process. But that is an area that I could highlight.
Yeah.
And also the 2025 accounts, the first set of accounts that we're responsible for, actually show a surplus. So the government spending seems to be relatively under control. Our income seems to be better than we were hoping, and actually Guernsey's in reasonable financial shape. The problems we're seeking to address in this tax package are not that the island is running out of money today. The problem is that we could run out of money in a few years' time, and our tax base is very unbalanced. So we're taking steps now to address the problem which is emerging, and we're hoping that will secure the island's future.
And just one final point to Emma's question, which is she talks about families and businesses having to balance their budgets. Well, the first thing I would say is that we have had an awful lot of engagement with businesses, and their feedback has been really, really helpful in actually informing the changes that we've made to the package to soften the impact on businesses. And also families, it's really important to remember that most families will actually be better off than they are now. So this should really help with that household budgeting. And I have to say, as someone with a large household myself, I really understand those pressures and the kind of juggling and compromises that have to be made the whole time. So it's a really important point, but really key to remember that actually the majority of families in the island will in fact be better off under these proposals than they are at the moment. Okay, so we've got Sophie, who's asking, low to mid-income earners will be better off, but the money that we do save on not paying so much income tax is just going to go on all the increases from GST, for example, food, so we won't be better off. Everything is going to go up constantly as it is, let alone bringing in GST. Now, Sophie, this is something that I was also really concerned about. In other words, what you're suggesting, and I can understand why you are, that actually, yes, we're going to put more money in your pocket and because we're going to be taxing you that much less, so you will have more of your take-home pay. If you're an earner, you will have more disposable income than you do at the moment. And it's completely understandable that you might assume that the increase in costs might mean that that's just eroded. It's rendered meaningless. But actually, again, it comes down to proportion. And I know that this probably isn't the best format to use numbers, but I will give it a shot. So if we take an example, and this is going to really test my memory, if we use an example of someone who earns £30,000, they will be better off in terms of their take-home pay by about £1,375, so over £1,300. So that will be income that they've earned, but we're taxing them less on it, so they will have that much more in their pocket, in their bank account, than they do at the moment, all other things being equal. Now, if we think about a GST at 3%, remembering that it doesn't apply to rents, mortgage repayments, childcare, healthcare, care services, so some of those really big ticket items, then actually, in order to pay £1,375 worth as because of a 3% GST, you'd actually need to be spending something like £46,000. And if you're earning £30,000, that's more than your gross annual salary. So actually, this is about proportionality. You're quite right, Sophie, that we can expect some costs to go up, but the amount that those costs go up is very much smaller than the amount of additional income that you will be able to keep because that tax break is so significant. So I hope it's really difficult to use numbers in this kind of format, but I hope that helps to illustrate that it is about proportionality. You're right, the costs will go up, but the amount of income that you will keep is going to be so much more than what you would expect to spend, unless you're a high income household and you're spending an awful lot more. At that point, you would be spending more than any benefit you would receive because the benefits sort of peter out the higher income you get. Okay, so Tracy's asking, have you forecasted for when you push those higher earners off the island? Who will pay your bills then? This kind of touches on something that we had earlier, and I don't know, do you want to talk to it?
Well, yes, within the amount contributed by resident individuals, the burden will fall disproportionately on higher earners. But remember, Tracy, that only 20% of the total contributions will be paid by individuals at all. 80% of the tax that will be collected under these proposals will come from companies, employers, and tourists. So I think the effect even on high earners who are residents on Guernsey will be relatively small.
And it's also worth bearing in mind that actually we're real outliers in not having any GST or VAT at the moment. So if people were having a look around at different jurisdictions, they would be very, very hard pressed to find anywhere with a rate as low as 3%. So maybe that's worth also taking into consideration. Okay, we'll see if we got another question. We do. We've got one from Dave who says, what have you modelled as the impact of GST on inflation, and where have you assessed this to increase costs for the states of Guernsey? Okay. This is who wants to have a go? Everyone wants to have a go at this.
Well, what I can say is that the difference between 5% and 3% was looked at, and a 5% GST would have, we think, modelling, created inflation of 3.2%. And by reducing it to 3%, it comes down to 1.9%. And that is all modelled into the way in which we're trying to balance it through giving some money back in other ways.
Yeah. And actually, to your point about the increase in costs of the states of Guernsey, really good question. But let's just remember, if the states of Guernsey is paying GST, that GST comes back to the states of Guernsey. So it all balances itself out. So it's not a net cost at all, because any GST that is liable on anything that we spend is remitted back to the states. So it's net zero.
It could have an effect on the wage demands of the staff who work for the states of Guernsey. But overall, the states of Guernsey will be better off.
Okay, so we've got, I think, 5 or so minutes left, and I think we've got a couple of questions. So P&R, this is from Dominic, who says that P&R have said that many alternatives were looked at. Which ones were looked at? And were any of them a wealth tax, pied-à-terre tax, a capital gains tax, or a removal of the income tax cap utilised by the wealthiest people in Guernsey?
Well, we didn't look at any capital taxes because we took a decision very early on that to introduce capital taxes into Guernsey would have very unpredictable consequences, because the absence of capital taxes, particularly things like inheritance tax, is a big part of what makes Guernsey attractive to high net worth individuals who are thinking of moving. But we are looking at the tax caps. I said earlier that they're under review, and so it's too early to say what will happen with them, but that's something that you may see more of in the budget at the end of this year.
Yep. Okay. And we've got another question here from Peter, who asks, is this a welfare tax? I'm not quite sure I understand that question. Maybe Peter is saying, well, is this, if Peter's question is about, is this about the welfare of people in the island, then I think yes, that's been one of our core considerations, is making sure that people who really could do with some additional help in coping with the cost of living are actually getting that support. So in that sense, perhaps, but maybe I haven't really understood.
I would look at it through the other end of the telescope. So what we're doing is we're not bringing in a tax so that we can increase benefits. We're increasing benefits so that we are protecting the vulnerable from the new tax. I think that's very different to being a welfare state, or moving further into that territory than we are now. We do need to look after those people who are less well off within our community, and I think Guernsey has done that reasonably well. It can always be improved, and we know there are many people. I mean, last week we all visited the food bank, and we heard from Guernsey Welfare about, and we were reminded, it was not that we didn't know how many people are struggling, but I think this is the package as presented. It works the other way around, really. We're introducing a new tax, but we're also ensuring that that doesn't impact negatively on the most vulnerable in our community.
Yeah. And actually, it may well, because people with lower and even middle incomes will have more take-home pay, they will have more of their incomes because we're taxing that much less. Actually, we could see some people who, because they're that much better off, don't need to be reliant or as reliant on support. Whether that's through the states or from some of the amazing community organisations that we have in the island.
Given that's our last question, perhaps we should remind people of where we're going to be in the next few days.
Oh yeah, okay.
As well as if anybody is in town on Sunday, I shall certainly be there, and I think certainly another one or two of my colleagues on P&R will be there. On Saturday morning, we're at Les Beaucamps School between 10 and 12, which is hosted by the Catel Parish. And anyone who lives in St Martin's that wants to wander along tomorrow evening to the parish hall will be there from 7 p.m. So it would be good to meet as many people as would like to ask us questions. And also, please continue sending your questions in via email and social media, as you have been doing, and we're grateful for the engagement.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the business engagement and the community engagement and the engagement with various different sort of interest groups has really made a difference. I mean, sometimes a direct difference to what we've put forward. So yeah, thank you very much everyone for your engagement. Thank you for giving up your what day are we today? I've lost track. I was in Alderney yesterday, Tuesday evening, to join us here for the Q&A. As I say, these sessions are always really helpful for us as well in terms of hearing directly from members of the public, and hopefully we've been able to explain some of the aspects of the proposals that might not have been clear or you might have had questions about. But as Steve has said, if anyone does have questions remaining, there are some opportunities to come along and ask us in person or get in touch in other ways. So I think we are now out of time, but thank you very much, and hear from you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.